Okay, so we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Hutton. I'm the president of the Academy of Social Sciences, and we'll be starting this seminar this webinar in a second or two. But we'll just wait until people join in. The number of participants is rising. And I'm going to keep talking so that you know that there's something happening and we don't all kind of look at the screen in an untoward way. And I'm going to carry on chatting. Interestingly, I learned this this lunchtime, for those going on the call, that the white paper on levelling up is expected now before Christmas, sometime in the next 4 to 5 weeks. So it's particularly kind of useful time to be holding a webinar of this type, a TEDx-based webinar. So I just wait for another 30 seconds, and then we'll kick off, and I'll introduce the next 2 hours and set out how we're proposing to hold this. So it is being recorded. Well, I think we'll crack on. It's now 4:33 on my reckoning. Good afternoon, welcome to everybody to this TEDx style virtual reality webinar on levelling up principles and practice, which we at the Academy of Social Sciences, with our campaign for social sciences, are holding with Sage Publishing, and thank you, Sage, for your support for this. I mean, every single person on the call is across the notion of levelling up, and the more and I do think that social science is certainly what we know as social scientists is kind of so rich that I think the precondition for successful levelling up is policymakers, government, both kind of in our nations, central government, nations and a devolved government, should take kind of the kinds of insights and evidence that we can marshal, really seriously. And what we've tried to do in the next kind of couple of hours is to get some leading social scientists, and thank you all for giving up your time, together with people who are actually kind of engaged in the practice of levelling up, either in business or in finance or in government, to kind of really put our heads together and see whether we can come up with something that may inform policy. Neil O'Brien, the levelling up minister, will be joining us later. We've had, and I had a call from Ben Houchin's office, who just a few hours back, saying that he's involved in some key commercial negotiations in the Tees Valley, and sadly can't join us. So I'm sorry about that. We'll get him there to speak on another occasion. I do think the challenge is extraordinary. As Adrian will set out in a second or two, GVA per head in London is nearly 80% higher than the rest of the UK. And that's a gap that is close to unparalleled in Europe and actually within the OECD. It's extraordinary. Successive governments have tried to address it, plainly not successfully. And it's to Boris Johnson's credit that he has raised the salience of it and pinned his colours to the mast. And his speech in Birmingham, where he actually kind of drew attention to differential life expectancy, differential life chances, was quite considerable. And actually his own kind of political commitment to doing something, I think, is to be welcomed. It's going to take longer than just his tenure in office. This is going to be a decade or 2 decade long project. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought that, of course, it's an economic program, but it's a social program, it's a political program, but it's also a growth program for Britain. there's no way you can lift trend growth rates in the UK and address issues like stagnating life expectancy in parts of the country without kind of getting this right. And so it's in that lens or that perspective that we've kind of organizing this afternoon. There's 5 areas where I think there's 5 headings under which we can think about this: skills, innovation, finance, infrastructure, and structures of governance. And we're going to be addressing all of those in the next kind of 2 hours. The way we're going to do it is there'll be 4 speakers starting in literally about 30 seconds. Then we'll pause for questions and answers. So please put your questions and answers in the chat function, and I will try and pick them up and put them to the speakers. Then we'll roll on with our next 4. And then another Q&A session. And then I've asked Neil O'Brien to wrap up the whole thing, his reflections on what he's been briefed on, and we'll finish it with a hard stop at 18:30. So in the chat function, you should find, if it's working as I hope, a biography of each of the speakers as they speak. So I'm not going to take time up by kind of telling you how wonderful they are and how accomplished they are and how significant they are. That's all. That's all in their biographies in the chat function. Take it from me. They're all damn good, and they've all got fascinating things to say. So look, with no more ado, I'm going to ask Adrian Pabst, Professor Adrian Pabst, Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, to kick off. And there with his slides, he's there. So you have the microphone. Adrian, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for putting this on and for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. I want to talk about where we are at present, and then what can be done and how levelling up might be done. I'm calling it regional regeneration, which I think captures it rather better, because levelling up might suggest that we're sort of, levelling back to some sort of status quo, and it's precisely the status quo that is broken, and therefore we need a different model and different approaches. So very briefly, where we are and then what should be done and how. I want to start with 3 stylized facts, if I may. And the first one is that labour productivity per head in London is now nearly 70% higher than virtually anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And the second stylized fact is that more than half of all foreign direct investment and 2/3 of venture capital investment for businesses big and small is going to businesses in the southeast, and of course, especially London. And that is another indication of the sheer disparities. And then the third stylized fact is, and Will hinted at that in his introduction, the UK has one of the most centralized political and financial systems among all 38 industrialized countries of the OECD. So that, I think, already paints a picture. Well, what is essentially the framework that enables us to understand what's happening? Well, this isn't a simple story of North versus South or city versus province. Rather, it is a question of widening disparities economically as well as socially, and they're happening in different ways. So one is a pattern of differentials in productivity, growth, wages, and other economic indicators that is both a pattern within regions, but also between regions. So it's not the case that the whole of the Southeast is wealthy, or the whole of London for that matter. There are also huge disparities within these regions, but then also between regions in the UK. The second point is about growing income and asset inequalities. So they are widening rather than reducing. And linked to that, many pockets of social deprivation. So where jobs, wages, life chances, opportunities are so low, that it's going to take a Herculean effort to get these places anywhere near a situation where people have something to live on and to flourish. Let me start with some charts just to illustrate some of these points. So here you can see our forecast at the National Institute for Economic Growth. We published this earlier today. This is the autumn forecast. Strong growth this year, of course, with 7%. This is still the COVID rebound. Still strong growth next year with nearly 5%, but then it tails off very quickly. So even in a lifetime of this parliament, we're going to be back to around 1.25% as an average growth rate between 2023 and 2025 and 6. And that means, we are not in an era of high growth yet. A lot more would have to happen for that to be the case. And then the real wage squeeze, which is really important for living standards and in that sense for raising, the level across the United Kingdom. You can see here that we are not predicting and not forecasting very strong real earnings growth. And this is on top of a decade of real wage stagnation since the financial crisis. Now, that is still in aggregate terms, so I'm very keen to move on to the distributional aspect, and we'll mention this at the beginning. Look at regional labour productivity in the United Kingdom, how far London is ahead of everywhere else, including parts of the South and the East, the Midlands, the North, and also the devolved nations of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And that, of course, is driving living standards and prosperity in very significant ways. And until we see, a huge catching up, we are only going to see disparities widen rather than reduce. Something similar is true when you look at it in terms of where we're going with this. So in 2019, pre-COVID, we already had London way ahead. It slightly changed at that point in 2020, but again, on current trends, we are back to a situation that's quite close to 2019. London way ahead, by about 70% compared with many other places. Now, this is not just true for productivity, it is also true for income per head, which you can see here, London and the wider southeastern area around it. And it's true for assets as well. There's a huge concentration in the south of the country, in particular, the southeast around London. And then, and this is the final chart for now, or cartogram, I should say, extreme poverty. So it's not only the case that we're seeing labor productivity, growth, and wages differ very widely, it's also that we've got areas of the country where destitution, which is extreme poverty, could double over the next year or two, especially in the Northwest. So that is in the absence of any further targeted policy intervention. It's a very worrying prospect because not only are these areas further falling behind, but the scarring, both economic and social, will be such they'll take another generation or two. So, things are getting worse, not better for people in those parts of the country. But it's not only the economy where we have to point out the disparities. They're compounded by differences in proximity to political and financial decisions. And government and finance are over-centralized in the United Kingdom, concentrated as they are in London and the Southeast. And it's this combination of centralized governance coupled with widening economic and social divergence that makes regional regeneration such an important priority. But the UK's system of government and governance is simply not fit for purpose. It is over-centralized and at the same time weak in terms of delivery. We don't have the institutions that connect the national to the regional and to the local level so that things really get done. We have a fragmented system where it's not clear who's really responsible for what. And we have an endless policy churn. In the area of higher and further education, to which I'll come back, there have been 35 different policies over the last 20 years. And that simply isn't a way of addressing deep-seated problems. Local government for a long time has been emaciated and emasculated with very, very few powers and levers to change things. And even the new regional levels, the city regions and the mayoralties, still lack substantial powers and resource in order to address the problems. And they may also not yet be sufficiently accountable to their own citizens and communities. They're largely essentially accountable to central government. Now, that may be not entirely true for the devolved administrations in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and to a lesser extent London, but I would suggest we are a long way from really functioning regional and local government in this country. And the current system, isn't going to be much improved through extra funding alone. Yes, that will help, it's a precondition, but we also need local delivery and we need institutions that can sustain both higher public spending and greater private investment over the longer term. So let me then turn in the second part of my presentation to what should be done and how. So I think some of the principles we need for regional regeneration are, first of all, a medium to long-term strategy. Again, Will mentioned at the beginning, it can't just be a few years. It has to really be a 10-year project, and in some respects, a generational one. It has to be at scale. We need the right sort of investment at scale. For instance, skills, 3 billion in the budget and the spending review is not nearly enough. It's not a revolution, it's a drop in the ocean. And we need to recognize all the interdependencies. So yes, it's great to focus on infrastructure in some ways. Obviously great to improve rails and bus services, but we need to connect the physical infrastructure to the digital and to the social infrastructure. We cannot treat these as somehow isolated or separate. So that means a joined up approach, much better policy coordination at the same levels and between levels, and also something in line with subsidiarity. That is, locating power and resource at the appropriate level. That can be the national level, of course, and national government will be critical, but it also needs to be local and regional government for many other areas. So in practice terms, what does that mean? A new institutional ecology, really, where the financial system needs to be decentralized and spread across the country. Skills need to be built up in critical areas, both sectors, but also regions of the country. We need innovation to benefit not just the frontier firms that are doing wonderfully well, and that's a great asset to the country, but also the long tail that isn't currently benefiting from dissemination of R&D, which again is very impressive in the UK, but it's just too concentrated in certain sectors and areas of the country. We need an infrastructure that is a lot better than what we currently have in physical, digital, and social terms, and a different government and governance system. I want to pick out 3 areas, and there will be the focus in the remaining few minutes. First of all, faced with over-centralized capital markets, what do we do? Where the money simply isn't flowing enough from London and the Southeast into the other parts of the country. We need regional and sectoral banks, strongly encouraged to lend within areas and sectors. Other countries have this. The US has a more decentralized financial system. Germany does. Britain does not, and that's a huge problem, as we will see in a minute when we see the concentration of firms. And I think combined with that is also expanding the remit of the National Infrastructure Bank. It's a great initiative. We at the National Institute welcome it. We've called for it for a long time. Excellent that it's located in Leeds. However, it should be broadened to be a whole national investment bank, because we need to support a lot more than simply infrastructure, however important that may be. And why do we need a different financial system with both regional and sectoral banks as well as a national investment bank? Well, here you can see where firm births are happening, and it's essentially, again, mostly in London and a lot less elsewhere. And you can see on the right-hand side, the connections. Again, London is absolutely at the center of everything. And that simply is not good for an economy that is very open, hence very vulnerable to shocks, and therefore needs to build up a lot more resilience across the board and not only have a powering center. So this economy is lopsided, and we've seen the results over the last 12 years since the financial crisis, the Brexit vote, and then COVID. The second area I want to briefly mention is skills. We've got a massive skills mismatch where we have not the right mix, and lots of areas are lacking in skilled labor. So the response has to be building partnerships between existing higher education and further education institutions in order to foster all the hybrid skills. So the skills that aren't purely academic or purely vocational or technical, but somewhere in between. So engineering, law, finance, banking, and many subjects are not just one or the other, they're both, and that's where you need the partnerships. It's essentially the missing middle in the Auger review. And so far, of course, we need to we have waited for the government to respond to Auger, and that will be a critical part of its response. Can it address the missing middle between pure HE and pure FE? But we also need to bring together businesses, trade unions, and local government in order to provide significantly more apprenticeships. It's a vital entry into the labour market. And whilst the apprenticeship levy is very good, the scale of it is still far, far too small. And then we need to create more vocational entry opportunities into the labour market, especially in the areas where we have acute skill shortages like health and social care, but also other parts that would support the economy. So in concrete terms, what that means is we need to really look at higher and further education in areas like Teesside, but also in places like Wolverhampton or Stoke or Huddersfield or Preston. where they all exist, but they are significantly underfunded, have had cuts for 10 years. And what's in the spending review and the budget is not enough to get this to a proper level. Or think of the mixed colleges in places like, well, in towns and cities that have fallen behind, like Preston, Blackpool, Southend, or Grimsby. They again deserve a lot more support than they're currently getting. Let me just show you very briefly a correlation between national vocational qualification levels and productivity. And again, you can see how the areas where you've got high qualifications also correlate with the areas where workers are very productive. And you've got this cluster of low productivity, low qualification, and that simply is holding many parts of the country back. Let me turn to the third and final area, and that is how we change policy, design, and delivery. And for that, we need to empower both local and regional government, boosting its capacity. Boosting its capacity by providing revenue streams that aren't directly controlled by the Treasury. The business rate retention scheme may be a step in the right direction, but again, we're saying that is not enough to really empower local government. We also need to strengthen its ability to adapt to local requirements so that needs and potentials are recognized, linking infrastructure to education, housing, and training, so it's all joined up and not in silos. And finally, enhance accountability to citizens and communities, not just to central government. So my conclusion for now is regional disparities are widening at the same time as the poorest households risk sliding into destitution. But in terms of our national history after the war, as well as international comparison today, there are lots of examples of how regional regeneration can be done. But what it does require is a long-term strategy at the appropriate level and scale, and with lots and lots of local and regional capacity to design and deliver both public spending and private investment. Otherwise, this is a top-down diktat from central government. It will not succeed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Adrian. I'm going to quickly move on to Stuart Martin, the CEO of the Satellite Applications Catapult. One swift observation, the book On Deaths of Despair by Angus Dayton, a prominent American social scientist, points out that, and it speaks to your point about NVQ4 and the linkages between that and productivity, that actually non-academic Americans are in a kind of downward economic and social vortex. You have a college degree, it's fine. If you're not, you're in real trouble. And for them, you know, it's not just a question of kind of leveling up the areas where they've clustered, it's actually leading to kind of lower life expectancy and extraordinary social distress. Social dimension of this as well as the economic one. But Stuart, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Will, and thank you very much to the Academy for inviting me to speak this evening on what is clearly a very critical issue facing all of us right now. My intent today is really to try and make the case for an ambitious vision for levelling up, founded on our strengths as a science superpower and as a nation of innovators. In the past, we've talked about rebalancing our economy for many years, and clearly the term levelling up is now in use because it's visually superior, because it does not imply that one side must come down so the other can rise. However, I think we do need to make sure that levelling up doesn't just come to mean forever catching up, and I think that's really the risk that we're in at the moment. And for that to happen, the aim must be to put all parts of our country together onto an equal economic footing, as we've just been hearing about. And for me, I think innovation is the key to enabling that. The world we live in today is very much the product of the Industrial Revolution, which took hold 200 years ago in the north of England. Yes, we now know that this has come at some cost to our climate and environment, but the benefits too are undeniable. The nations, including ourselves, who have benefited most from this revolution have seen huge improvements in the length and quality of our lives. The health and education systems we all now take for granted and the freedoms we all now enjoy all have their origins in that Industrial Revolution. This was the heyday of the north of England and for Britain, quite frankly, where we led the world in embracing the power of coal and steam, transforming industries as diverse as agriculture, manufacturing, textiles and shipping and many others. And through our canals and later the railways, which of course started between Stockton and Darlington, we had some of the most advanced transport infrastructure and systems in the world. The UK was without doubt the most innovative and economically successful country in the world at this time. It's also worth remembering that the wealth that this created and the improvements to health and education that this enabled was a major contributor in the transition to the services-based economy that we now enjoy, and which has been very much over the last 100 years driven the success of London and the Southeast. Again, all achieved through unrivaled innovation of global significance. So looking forward again, we're in a pretty unusual situation at the moment, a very unusual situation from a historical perspective, where we know the technological and societal advancements that we need to make this century to overcome our climate and environmental challenges. We know to some extent what the rest of this century needs to look like. We know there are problems we need to fix if we are to continue to thrive and prosper. We all know that the way we live in the second half of this century will be and needs to be fundamentally different from the way we live now. We need to fundamentally rethink our transport systems, our energy systems, our heat, our power, the way we use water, the way we produce food, the way we handle our waste. We need to do pretty much everything differently to the way we've all come to live our lives. But we also know that there are technology emerging that will help us. Renewable technologies, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, drones, robotic ships, 5G, 6G, and of course, in my case, space technology. Question is, how do we now affect this transition? We could leave it entirely to the natural forces of the market, demand for change and the supply of technology offering solutions. The market will sort it out. And whilst that's fine in principle, and there's no doubt the market will be critical, and looking back over the last 30 years, we might well see that the market has served us well with what has felt like a relentless change. However, just to take one data point, the internet has been around for 50 years. I first became aware of it and the importance of it in the early 90s. But here we are 30 years later, and we still don't have the internet in every home. And we've seen over the last 18 months what an important omission that's been for our society. Around the Western world, the situation is far worse. Getting the internet into every home is a trivial challenge compared with what we know we need to do over the next 30 years to our transport, energy, heating systems. So, in my mind, there's no doubt that we need to find a different way of doing things. In some countries, I'm looking at the NEOM project, which many people will be familiar with in Saudi Arabia. They're able to take a fresh start. They can look at a clean piece of paper and build a new city that's fit for the 21st century. And that's very much what they're looking to do out there. But for many of us, and most of us, this is not a realistic option. We need to think about how we upgrade the infrastructure that we have. And this is the real crux of my point. There are indeed many parts of the country that have been systematically underinvested for many years and have catching up to do. But we must think beyond that. We have a unique opportunity now to leapfrog our nation into the 21st century. Building on our scientific strengths and inventive prowess, we can kickstart a new green industrial revolution, just as we did 200 years ago. Let's look at this in just a little bit more detail. Our transport system. Let's reimagine now what a 21st century transport infrastructure and system could look like. We need to decarbonize our road systems, but we also need to eliminate congestion. It's been a real productivity killer for our economy, and it's only getting worse. Recently we've been looking at the transition to public transport as a solution to this, but that's taken a real hit during COVID as people have lost confidence in public transport and because of the risk of transmission. I think we need to look at sort of other solutions. How, for example, can we transform our logistics system? The paradigm of taking raw materials, transporting them halfway across the world to factories, transporting them halfway back across the world to distribution centers, and transporting them again to the end users and the customers. We've got to find better ways of doing this. Are there ways of taking the logistics off our roads completely? How do we embrace drone technology to do all the last mile deliveries and replace all those delivery vans that we've now got on our roads? Can we do better things with electric barges on canals? We've got a chance now to really rethink the way that we do transportation in this country. And can we move to more local manufacturing? Again, part of that logistics transformation. Can we find ways of taking raw materials, embrace modern manufacturing techniques so that we do manufacturing much closer to where the demand is? Wouldn't it be great if our roads became a public amenity completely free of industrial traffic? But we've got a real chance now to try and look at that possibility and see what advancements we can do to make that happen. And again, on the energy sector, the transition to renewables is well underway, and we need to accelerate that. So much of that is happening in the parts of the world that are now, we're now talking about, part of the country that we're now talking about for levelling up. We still have questions over base load power. Can we take more advantage of local energy production? As announcements today with Rolls-Royce. Is space-based solar power an option? I think that's something people in my sector are starting to look at now, where we can collect the power in space and beam it back using microwaves down to collecting stations down on Earth. Some of the industries that will be hardest to crack, steel, maritime, aviation, have their history firmly embedded in our industrial heartlands. These are the natural places to be investing in developing solutions. And the debate now about opening a new coal mine in Yorkshire, we know that if we don't open up this coal mine, we will, the demand for steel isn't going to decrease, so we will be importing steel, which is probably an even higher carbon footprint. So can we make that as part of our commitment to develop low carbon steel and move towards zero carbon steel in Yorkshire, which is for so long been the heartland of the steel industry. Just as it was at the economic progress of the Industrial Revolution that enabled the services economy to develop, the knowledge centres now largely in the south will be able to kickstart this new transition. Once we get it underway, the new investment in science, innovation and economic growth will go straight into what are now the underinvested regions that need it most. And we will have created the high growth, balanced, well-distributed economy and the fair and equal society that we all aspire towards through the power of innovation. I'm just going to give a couple of very quick examples to try and bring this a little bit to life. So we heard that this isn't all about the difference between the north and south. Some of the most deprived areas around the country are in our coastal regions. We've been working on a project with DCMS to deliver 5G into Dorset using our sort of 5G core network at Prescott in Buckinghamshire. We're using satellite to control the network in Dorset, a very dispersed network using retired TV spectrum to deliver services out to 10 miles out at sea. And the feedback we're getting from the agricultural community, the users out on the sea, including people like the RNLI, the Coast Guard, has been phenomenal. It's completely transforming the way that they operate. And so that's very much looking like something we're going to look to expand around the rest of the country. And it's a great example of just rethinking how this infrastructure could be. And a project I'm not directly involved in, but there's announcements today, some of you may have seen, Reaction Engines, a company based in Oxfordshire who are developing an air-breathing rocket engine, which will completely transform space transportation. But they're taking a component of that, their cooling system, to crack ammonia. I'm not even really sure what that means, to crack ammonia, but it's going to deliver, it has the potential to deliver carbon-free fuel to the maritime and the aviation sectors, two sectors that are some of the toughest to crack in terms of decarbonisation, and two of the sectors that the natural place to develop and grow this technology would be in some of the regions around our country that we're now talking about levelling up. So what I hope I've been able to do in my few minutes today is just to give a sense of the huge opportunity I believe we now have. This is a unique time where we know what we need to do and when we need to do it. We know from experience that we can't leave this to the natural order of the markets alone to resolve. We must mobilise a society, bringing public and private sector actors together at an unprecedented scale, and decide that we want to deliver this change. We do have the best science and technology, but as so often, that is not what will determine who prevails. It's about who has the strongest will to execute. If we do decide that, and I think this is really the most exciting thing, there is nowhere on earth better placed than we are here in the UK to succeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks. So kind of vision of leveled up, or to be leveled up Britain, leapfrogging over a period. I mean, London and the southeast. I love the idea of space-enabled drones using up spare TV spectrum to, get Wi-Fi into marginal regions of the country. Fantastic. Well, I think we should move along very fast, actually. And I think the next speaker is Sandra McNally. Let's look. And she has her slides, and Professor Sandra McNally, over to you. And please look for people's biography in the chat function if you want to know who people are. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Will, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about what does levelling up imply for skills. So this first picture shows a map of the proportion of people with post A-level qualifications in England and Wales. So that's usually university degrees. And as we've seen from other people's graphs, there's a concentration there in London and the southeast, and it's less prevalent elsewhere in the country. It's important to note that this doesn't primarily reflect how good schools are in different parts of the country, that educational outcomes is itself an output of different forms of inputs. So the most important thing that influences educational outcomes is actually family background. If people are not living in great areas, if they have good jobs, if they are living in poverty, it's very hard for them to provide the right environment for their children to thrive and to do well and to go on to university. So a large part of the reason why we see this sort of dispersion in educational outcomes is because of these problems, these other deep-seated inequalities that really we have to address if we also want to address educational outcomes. And these are things that need to be addressed through national level policies as well as regional level policies. This next picture shows the highest educational achievement of people by age 26 in a recent cohort, full cohort of people going through their GCSEs. And it shows that about 35% of people have at that stage just education up to GCSEs or perhaps lower than that or the equivalent. That there's a further about 25% who achieve at most upper secondary qualifications, A-levels or BTECs equivalent. And then there's about 40% that have tertiary education at this stage, which would be mostly university degrees. If I were to characterize the problems of England, is that we have too many people who have low-level qualifications and not enough people who have tertiary level vocational education. So we need to try to help enable people to reach their potential, to progress them through the system better, as well as to attend to the quality of education at every level. There's a particular issue with vocational education in that there isn't very many places that people can go. If they've done vocational education in college and they perhaps would do something else, there just isn't that much provision, despite the fact that there's actually quite high returns to the provision that exists. Regions are differentially affected by national problems, and post-16 education is a good example of that. Those with lower achievement often do vocational education and go to FE colleges. FE colleges are poorly funded relative to schools, and they do not have any pupil premium, which is very bad considering how many people with disadvantaged backgrounds go to FE colleges. There's also some important structural issues that post-16 pathways are complicated, especially if you're not on the academic track. And it's difficult to plan your way forward, to know exactly what you're going to do. Apprenticeship provision at lower levels has declined, and a degree apprenticeships is not a good substitute for this. The availability of BTECs in college has helped more people go to university than in the past. It's been a good way to advance social mobility. There has been a lot of discussion about whether they would be removed to make way for T-levels, and hopefully the government is backing down on what they said previously. But this would be very harmful for a significant number of students and would be damaging for social mobility. The longer term challenges in this area is to address narrowness of educational provision. This is an issue for academic education as well as for vocational education. We've heard Stuart talking about how differently the world is going to be. It has to be in the future compared to how it's been now. And this means that people need to have the foundational education to be able to train appropriately for the new things that become available. If you have too narrow an education between 16 and 18, you're simply not equipped to do that. And the narrowness is also an issue in apprenticeship standards. We have over twice as many apprenticeship standards as in Germany, and this means that people are educated to work in particular jobs, but they're not very well educated in apprenticeships if they want to move between jobs in similar areas. Adult skills is a huge issue of all the areas of education. Education spending has reduced in real terms over time, but in the last 10 years, government spending on adult education is 50% lower than it was. One of the ways this is manifest is that adults find it difficult to get financial support for study if they need to retrain. And there have been some government reforms, planned reforms to try to address that. But if you are somebody, for example, with an A level, but you want to retrain to do something different, you will not get government funding to be able to retrain at that level, even under the new reforms. That is much less generous than many other countries. In addition to the fact that FE colleges don't have enough funding, their funding rules are also complex and inflexible, and this means they can't really do long-term planning. So even, for example, if they would want to put on STEM courses, they may not be able to plan over a long-term horizon, and those courses are also quite expensive to put on. So that's a reason why they're not provided at greater scale than they are. And also spending for retraining is not just about government expenditure, it's also about private sector investment, but you do need to incentivize that. Firms are incentivized to invest in capital much more than they are incentivized to invest in people. You could address this through the tax system. For example, you could introduce human capital tax credits that work a bit like R&D tax credits, which would go some way to address this. But providing incentives for apprenticeship is no way enough for what's needed. And finally, of course, in any levelling up agenda, there is an important role for regional policy. Most obviously, to my mind, in the case for adults for retraining and skilling. And it is important to do that in the context of an economic plan. So you need to look at what the demand for skills are, rather than just decide you need to have more skills and put on courses that maybe bear no relation to what's needed in the local area. Adults who need retraining often need more specific and short-term training than those at the outset of their career. So they're beyond the stage of foundational education, and they actually need to do training that's more geared to a particular job. So that means providing something different for adults than you do provide for young people. There have been some well-documented success of sectoral training programs in the United States. And the kinds of characteristics they have is that they're geared towards the needs of local employers. They're managed by community organizations or private agencies. They entail training in specific occupational and soft skills as well. Soft skills are often overlooked. People sometimes talk about high-level technical skills. And although those things are important, there are returns to soft skills as well. And that's something that it's important to invest in. And then finally, these programs also involve follow-up with services after job placement to ensure that employees get a sufficient wage, because people will not engage in retraining, especially not as adults, if they really don't think it's worth their while. I'll stop there.
Sandra, thank you very much. And one of my takeaways from your presentation is very much the need for kind of skills policy to be place-based, sector-based, with a very firm eye. If you're going to get 16-year-olds kind of to go the non-academic route and for it to be rewarding, they need to know that the skills they're acquiring are relevant to the workplaces around them. And it really was a kind of got really, and that of course means some points Adrian was making in his presentation, a kind of underlying the same thing, and points up the case for kind of an enhanced role for kind of local government and the locality really. But look, last in this section falls to Layla Page, head of sustainable banking at NatWest and former chief of staff in the commercial division. You can see her CV in the chat function. And Layla, over to you with no more ado. How did NatWest see the levelling up challenge?
Thank you, Will, and thank you already to Adrian, Sandra and Stuart. It's been fascinating to hear your reflections. And to Adrian's point about the importance of finance, Will's asked me here to talk about what we see as the role of financial services in supporting the levelling up agenda. And as a bank with over 19 million customers and which supports 1 in 4 businesses in every region in the UK, we're privileged to play a central role in the UK economy. And we've already heard how interconnected growth is with levelling up. But before we get into the financial and funding, I think it's worth reflecting and have seen some of the questions being pulled out in chat on the broader role of corporates in society. So we know as a large corporate that we benefit from the structures that make up a stable and prosperous society, whether that's security and trust, whether that's education and skills, or whether that's just openness, opportunity and innovation. And all of that is critical to allowing us to operate, but it has to be reciprocal. And so in return, we know that we have a responsibility to create enhanced social value. And that's why a couple of years ago, we launched our purpose-led strategy and set out our ambition to champion potential and help people, families and businesses to thrive. And at the heart of this is our drive to create the greatest shared value for our present and future stakeholders, both by understanding and balancing their needs, and then in so doing, fostering and deepening these relationships. And we've chosen 3 areas where we think that we can make the most meaningful difference. Enterprise and learning, because research shows us that supporting business and helping people build skills and capabilities are the 2 areas that can make a fundamental difference to their lives. And we've just heard that in terms of skills and capabilities from Sandra. And climate, because this is the existential challenge we face as a society today, which speaks to some of the points that Stuart was making. But all of this directly links to levelling up, because championing potential and helping people to thrive is another way of talking about creating and spreading opportunity. So what's the bank's role in this? We obviously had a view, but one of the things that we thought was really important was to hear from our customers and communities. We have a huge presence in our communities, connecting with 1 in 4 adults across the UK as retail customers and over 1 million SMEs. And we've over 60,000 employees, and recognise that our people, our colleagues, are our biggest local asset. So last year, we ran a couple of pieces of research working with the Centre for Social Justice, exploring what thriving really means to those communities and asking those communities how NatWest could help. And what we found was that we are united in communities by common building blocks of community: the need for security, the need for supportive and social networks, and the need to belong. And the pathway to security is stability. So this can be physical and psychological, but it can also be security born of economic and financial stability, built through resources, skills, and connections. Again, pointing to Adrian's point about deprivation and how building that capability can be a route out of that. The pathway to belonging is agency. So the opportunity to build skills and nurture talents and then give back. And we see volunteering in this context as both a consequence and a cause of agency. And finally, this research showed that people tended to view all sectors as responsible for building thriving communities, starting with themselves and their own role, but they also asked for help to build the skills and agency to do so. And that's where we as NatWest can come in. But we can't do everything, and we can't do it alone. This is really about us deploying and combining all of our assets intelligently, so human, social, and financial capital to help people thrive. And absolutely a fundamental part of that is funding. We're the UK's leading business bank. We've £47 billion of net lending to SMEs. So we know that one of our core roles is a lender, and we've made a series of funding commitments to support the delivery of this strategy. So again, to Stuart's point about innovation, we've just committed to providing 100 billion of funding for climate and sustainable finance to the end of 2025. And that's because we understand that finance is a key enabler in the drive to net zero. And our role is as much about supporting innovation and encouraging innovation so our customers can benefit from the opportunities that are coming, as well as it is about stopping harmful behaviour. Enterprise is one of our focus areas because we know enterprise is the lifeblood of a thriving economy. And so we're committed to removing barriers and providing more opportunities to support companies as they grow, and with a specific focus on supporting underrepresented groups and tackling geographic inequality. And again, to Adrian's point about funding being very much concentrated in London, we have committed to helping create an additional 50,000 new businesses by 2023, and for 75% of these to be created outside London and the South East. And we've also committed that 60% of these should be led by females and 20% to come from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, because this is how we are going to tackle the barriers to those underrepresented groups. And we've set aside 2 billion in a fund specifically to support female-led businesses since 2020. And it's also why earlier this year we made a commitment to dedicate 6 billion to supporting SMEs to scale and grow, and put 4 billion of that to be allocated outside London, because we recognise the need for funding not to just be concentrated in London. And it's also why, beyond debt funding and through our private banking business, we've partnered with the British Growth Fund to raise and provide additional funding and growth capital to support SMEs. And again, their focus is very much UK-wide. But it's more than about funding, because financial capital is just one element of the help that we can provide and that people need. So as well as the funding, this year we've had over 35,000 interactions with entrepreneurs in the first half of the year on mentoring, webinars and coaching. Is why we've invested in 12 accelerator hubs, again, located throughout the UK, to provide entrepreneurs with access to co-working spaces, mentoring, tailored events, and a community of like-minded entrepreneurs. And to give you a sense of the impact that just that investment in the accelerator hubs has had, the total turnover of businesses supported by this accelerator program since 2018 is 362 million. And 2,600 jobs have been created. And really that's when we get to the essence of what we see our role is. It is, what is the tangible, practical help that we can provide in addition to the financial capital. Sandra talked about how critical skill building was, and that's why learning is another focus area for us. So earlier this year, we set out an ambition to grow our learning ecosystem so that we can impact employability across wider society. And as much as focusing on colleagues and developing their capability and building that culture of continuous learning, it's also about extending this offering beyond the bank. And that's why we've just launched our Learning Academy, which is a new online learning resource open to all on our websites. And it's focused on employment, financial capability, enterprise, future skills and climate, because those are the areas where we think we've got the capability to help. And it goes to the point discussed earlier about security. By building financial capability, we're helping to create economic security. I've mentioned the focus on tackling geographic inequality, and this links to a further role that we see as critical beyond being a funder and a donor, and that's the bank as a convener. So we see our role as bringing together relevant parties across our ecosystem and making connections. And just to highlight, one of the ways that we do this is through our regional boards, which we have 7 spread across the United Kingdom, and they bring together senior leaders across the business to ensure a one bank approach. So almost these boards are how we deliver the heft of the national bank regionally. Last year, we helped set up the SME Transformation Task Force, which was a cross-party coalition of politicians, business groups and industry organisations to push forward recommendations from the Springboard to Recovery report. And this year, we broadened this with the launch of Regional SME Transformation Task Force, again, bringing together local stakeholders who know and have the knowledge to share insights and debate the potential next steps for supporting SMEs. So our role, and I'm conscious of time, but I would say our role is multifaceted, but ultimately at its heart, we believe that by using our combined human, social and financial capital, we can champion potential and help people, families and businesses to thrive. And in so doing, we will ensure our future success, because effectively our success is dependent on our customers thriving. So thanks, Will.
Layla, that is quite a testimony from a bank. I mean, British banks have not typically engaged with SMEs. A SME transformation program is a bit of a landmark thing. And again, the accusation is often banks are highly centralized. And you've talked about creating 7 regional kind of boards. Just 10 seconds, literally 10 seconds. I mean, you know, I think everyone's going to be impressed by this, but they want to know what sits behind it. Can you kind of, I mean, just give us some sense of, from your experience in banking, how this is different from the NatWest you joined and how it's different from other banks?
And I think it sits at the heart of our focus to becoming purpose-led. And that comes back to the idea of believing that we should play a role in bringing a broader benefit to society. So I think that is really at its root, and knowing that is based on our relationships, being a relationship-led bank, and relationships being even more critical in a digital world, and understanding that we can't, you know, relationships are long-term, and they're about knowing and understanding needs and then working together and collaborating to meet those needs. So I think it's that real shift to being a relationship bank.
Well, it's great to hear. Look, some questions very quickly, and then we'll get on to the next half of the session. There's a question from Liz Todd to you, Stuart, which essentially is, you know, given the kind of institutional kind of weaknesses and failures that we all know exist, and Adrian outlined and others have outlined, how come you're so damn optimistic?
Fair question. I am an optimistic person, I guess. I take some comfort from, well, the statement that we often hear from investment groups that you know, past performance is no guarantee of the future. I take some comfort from the fact that that applies to governments as well. And there is actually an opportunity to change. And some of the things that we're seeing coming through in the new innovation strategy and the new space strategy, particularly in the way that the government intends to change the way it procures innovation and is a procurement of innovative services, I think can be quite transformational quite quickly. And that would unlock a lot of latent private investment in supporting some of the, you know, the technology advancement and the business advancement I've been talking about. So I think there are opportunities to actually move quite quickly if the desire is there to do it.
Robert Beveridge asks, have any other countries had positive experience of human capital tax credits? Human capital tax credits. I think that's one for you, Sandra.
That's fine. Just to explain what human capital tax credits actually are. They're when you invest in skills, you don't just, you claim back a credit through the tax system that doesn't just cover the cost of the skills, but gives you something extra as well. And if you make a loss, it turns into a subsidy. Or it is a subsidy in any case, but it would turn into an actual financial transfer. So, you know, it's possible, and that's the way R&D subsidies work. Austria and the US have, places within the US have documented that they have introduced human capital tax credits. We couldn't find an actual evaluation of them when we were writing our briefing note, and we do have a briefing note if anyone wants to contact me to see it. So there has been some positive experiences, but I haven't seen a rigorous evaluation yet.
Rob McMillan asks Adrian, your proposals remind him of older discussions of stakeholder capitalism, pursuing a German model. Is that the only viable political economy? Does it have traction with the government? Adrian, what's your view? Is would you line up with We Stakeholder Capitalists? I'm unashamedly an advocate of stakeholder capitalism, I have to say. Over to you.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that question was probably addressed at you, Will, perhaps more than me. But I think the stakeholder idea is vital because an economy, as Leila and others have remarked, cannot thrive if simply one interest, say shareholder interest, is mostly catered for. There has to be a proper reconciliation of rival interests, and that means finding common ground. There's lots of common ground, growth, productivity, jobs, secure communities, places where people can call home and that are safe and provide a sense of belonging. This is in everyone's interest. There's no loser from that. There are very few winners from people having to leave their communities and all settle in London and the Southeast. So therefore, the idea of stakeholder capitalism is something that speaks to more than one set of interests is vital. And I think we are seeing elements of that. We saw with COVID. I mean, the negotiation of furlough was a great success of bringing together government, business, trade unions, and civil society organizations and saying we don't have to have mass unemployment. There are ways that we can avoid mistakes that were made in the interwar period and since then. So some more I think collective bargaining, some more democratic corporatism, if we want to call it that, I think is right. Nothing to do with the state imposing its will. It's really about getting the rival interests around the table. And I think there is a lot of common ground and we should explore it. So yes, whether it has traction in government, I think remains to be seen. Can it be institutionalized will be the question. The furlough thing was great, but it was ad hoc. Let's see whether government are prepared to, provide some more institutional backing for these things, not just, throwing money at problems.
Okay, well, there's a few more questions I'd like, but I might just wait until we've got through the next kind of, the second leg of this. I want to make sure that we make it to and finish by 18:30. So Professor Christine Whitehead is our next speaker on kind of infrastructure planning, housing. Again, details of her impressive biography in the chat function. Christine, over to you.
Thank you. Not quite sure how to get in. Right.
Yes, there you are.
Sorry, thank you. I'm being lazy. I hate doing the screen sharing myself, so the team is generously doing it for me. Thank you so much. My subject is, can housing and planning help? Now, I think it's fair to say that an awful lot of people think that levelling up is fundamentally about a housing situation and the crisis in housing across the country. Well, I think most of us here would think it's very, very much more broad, but also that housing is a major constraint on the sorts of things which we've been talking about up till now. So can housing and planning help? I'm going to be a bit awkward and say yes, but in a way you might not expect. First of all, just to clear away certain things, what do we mean by levelling up? It's been interpreted as being north versus south. It's been interpreted as being London and the southeast versus the rest of the country. And it's beginning to feel as though we've got two countries now. In fact, we've got an additional country because London is seen as being separate and at some level bad, which is rather difficult. Or more generally, it's about concentrations of disadvantage anywhere in the country. Is it about opportunities that are not being taken? That's what Gove stressed yesterday at the Select Committee, but it was about untaken opportunity, which is quite an interesting basis. Is it more about resources being underutilized? Well, we're saying that certain resources are simply just not there. But the potential opportunities not being recognized or developed, and we're not taking full account of the path dependency and the need for synergy. Or is it simply, which many people fear, simply about redistribution, which would mean levelling up must mean levelling down somewhere else? Optimists, and we're obviously all optimists here, that's why we're listening or doing or speaking, see the possibility of a win-win situation But that's not going to happen easily. And it hasn't happened in earlier times when we've tried to do this. We've sometimes had some success. And it is inherently place-based, and we need to stress that more perhaps than we've done so far today. No single initiative can make a really major difference of its own. We've got to do different factors together. We've got to build health, education, skills, transport, housing. But fundamentally, we've got to get more out of less, and that means productivity. But I do think that it would be not suitable to say that it doesn't depend upon government putting in seed corn and ending guessing winners. And government has been particularly bad at guessing winners in the past. So the devolved authorities, etc., are going to have to help a great deal on that. It's about local government structures and funding. But where does housing fit into this? I think that an awful lot of people would argue that the way that government policy is running at the moment, it's hindering, not helping. And I think this is really important. The numbers game, the 300,000 that you've got to be produced, the 80-20 rule by which we put money where the affordability is worst, is actually concentrating the investment in London and the Southeast, and the affordability and the numbers do the same thing. So I think, and this has been said a number of times this week, for the first time for a long while, that the numbers game is not helpful of itself. The second reason it's not helpful is it raises enormous political tensions, which we keep seeing in the housing context. And the way that government responds to those political tensions is not necessarily good for the longer term. So in the South, we're desperate about the loss of green belt in particular, while in the North, there's a really strong wish to build more and to improve conditions in that sense. Now, there was a report brought out by Building Back Better yesterday, day before yesterday, which says, well, we need to be able to move the housing to the north because, sorry, not to the north, but to the areas which we're dealing with, because people are going to go for the opportunities there, and therefore there will be far more people living in these areas, and therefore the housing needs to be built there implicitly rather than in the Southeast, where there is a clear and current problem. They also talk about modern methods of construction and the importance of this, which again is a long-term issue. So I do think the allocation of housing infrastructure funding, which is also an 80-20 thing, is based on affordability criteria, reinforces the concentration of investment. And if we look at the things which are already underway and in the plans, like the ARC from Oxford to Cambridge, the vast possibility is that that is really going to do things south of the ARC, unless we work consciously to move it out to a much greater extent than we have at the moment. But government responds to the political tensions which have been there and said, oh dear, we can't build too many houses in the nice southeast. So the political decision has been to move the housing requirements into central cities, where it is quite enormously difficult to build that sort of numbers because it just isn't the suitable land. So London is meant to double their output levels. Absolutely no way is that going to happen. And I think that the same is true for other cities. So where I think levelling up does fit in is in improving the existing stock, and that the increasing emphasis on net zero will be enormously helpful because it is inherently across the country and it can bring jobs across the country. And one of the Building Better thing is to build skills bases for the construction industry across the country. There needs to be new technology, new skills, scale economies. Given the current poor quality of housing, in many of the left behind areas, there's a significant health and well-being benefits to coming from improving the housing stock. We spend too much time worrying about the physicality of the housing stock and not about whether people living in it can be helped to need less health services, to be able to develop education very much better. Lots of kids live in housing where they can't be really able to do the best they can. We think too narrowly about what the benefits might be. But the important thing is this all requires funding. And where is the funding coming from? Productivity benefits will come in the future, but they won't come immediately. And the National Housing Federation says we need 36 billion just to improve the housing association sector up to basic standards. What about planning? Well, the simplified system, which you may know about or you may not, which has been put out last year by the government, which is now on hold because Mr. Gove wishes to rethink it, is a simplified system which speeds up housing development. It's almost its only objective, and incentivizes more investment across the country. But it does place some emphasis on brownfield sites, and that could help the industrial areas quite a lot. The proposed substitution of an infrastructure levy rather than the Section 106 SIL development contributions is based on the value of new development. Well, the values, as we were shown to begin with, are mostly in the south. So this is going to provide money for the south, or at least for higher valued areas, including those in the north. It is not going to provide money of itself for the more deprived areas. And indeed, it is ruled out that the money can be transferred from one local authority to another. So it's a massive no-no in terms of the way in which we might actually level up. So how could housing help leveling up? Well, this is where I've come apart in terms of what I think should happen, but which has not the slightest chance of happening, I feel. Reform council tax and redistribute the money in the ways that council tax has always been redistributed, but with a hell of a lot more to do it with. At the moment, the way that council tax is organized, richer people or people in better housing pay proportionately less council tax than people in poorer housing, in area by area. And secondly, council tax hasn't increased significantly over the last 30 years. So it's starved local authorities of the funding which they need to build infrastructure to make the system work. And it's worsened income and wealth distribution. And of course, when you do build infrastructure, what happens? House prices go up, but we do not tax that increase. And so we get higher house prices rather than better funding regimes. So it can only be changed by changing the tax system, something which we have been trying to do for 30 odd years and we are not succeeding. It's politically unacceptable to modify council tax, even though it's a complete nonsense at the moment. I've got a couple of quick examples there. I moved in 35 years ago to the house which I'm in. I pay £200 more tax on council tax than I did 35 years ago. Complete and utter nonsense. And equally, my colleague who lives next door to a castle or fairly near a castle pays exactly the same council tax as the castle with the grounds does. It needs reforming. There is money there and it can be used to help the levelling up approach. So there needs to be much more redistribution, but it can't be done all at once, and it will be incredibly unpopular, and therefore it probably will not happen. But it would devolve funding to where it needs to be, and it would help all of these other ideas which have been coming over this evening. So what's the message? Current policies in housing are worsening inequalities and making it much harder for disadvantaged areas to improve. Concentrating on housing numbers and only on housing numbers does nothing to stabilize house prices, reinforces inequalities, lots of potential opportunities in terms of new technologies, higher skills, but they need seed corn, they need funding. And it needs stronger regional and local powers and money to help generate the necessary synergies. So we need a new sort of funding, and the only one I can see is council tax. And I'll stop.
Thank you. It is extraordinary that there hasn't been a revaluation of property for 30 years, and your points on council tax are, I'm sure, well made. Well, I know are well made. But look, with no more ado, let's go over to another fellow of the Academy, Lord Bob Kerslake. Again, you'll find his CV in the chat function, and I think we better crack on. Bob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Now, I want to talk a bit about the work that the UK 2070 Commission has done to set the context, but I particularly want to focus on the issue of devolution and its crucial importance to the task of rebalancing the UK or levelling up. But let me just move on to the next slide, if I can. And talk a bit about the definition, and it touches on something that Christine talked about. I was at an event recently where they didn't ask what do you think the government's policy is on levelling up, which is quite a tough one, but actually what do you think the policy on levelling up should be? And for me, it's about two key things. It's about people and it's about places, two dimensions. The people point, you might argue, is about creating a more equal society and lifting people out of poverty. And in that sense, it's not an issue of where they live. Their life is no doubt equally as challenged, whether it's in London or in Liverpool. In fact, you can argue that if you're on very low and or uncertain incomes, London is even harder because of the other high cost issues. And it seems to me that much of what we would want to do in creating a more equal society goes to questions of taxation, benefits, and indeed things like the minimum wage. I differentiate that because I think that's for every part of the country from the issue of places, where there is a very specific issue in this country about the scale of the regional imbalances. And that's been the focus of the UK 2070 work. And that is unambiguously about places. And I think we need to always have in mind that there are two agendas going on here that need to be recognized in the discussions that we have. Go on to the next slide. Now, if you pick up nothing else from what I say, I wanted to hammer home these points really as kind of precursors to what I say in a moment. First of all, the inequalities are long-standing in this country. A colleague of mine pointed me to a paragraph in David Kinston's book about 1962 that talks about this issue, and indeed talks about the experiences of the northern child as it's described in this article. So this is a long-standing issue. The second point is that yes, you will find inequalities in every developed country. The point is they're massively bigger in this country, and we need to recognize that the regional disparities are outliers as far as the rest of the developed world is concerned. I'll come back to that. Third point, we're moving in the wrong direction. Unless we do something about it, the challenge will get bigger. And I think Christine talked about the issue on housing, which I would entirely endorse. And then finally, we will not deliver on levelling up without decentralisation and devolution. But that needs to align with national thinking. It's not one or the other. You need both to work together. Move on to the next slide as I can, Chris. Here's a slide which I'm very grateful actually to Ron Martin, who's just about to produce a book with Ben Gardner, Andy Pike, Peter Sunby and Peter Tyler on this whole issue of levelling up and left behind places. And he's extended the kind of graph, if you like, to the furthest point we can get at the moment, 2017. And this just demonstrates the scale of the difference in growth, the long-standing nature of the problem we're talking about. And as I said earlier, you could have taken the graph back earlier to start the divergence. If we move on to the next slide, this one shows you the scale of the extent to which Britain is an outlier, the UK is. Professor Philip McCann of Sheffield University compared essentially 30 countries, developed countries, on a basket of 28 indicators. So he didn't just look at one indicator, he looked at 28. And guess where the UK came out? 28th out of 30 in its scale of regional inequalities. So people will tell you about France and other places and about the fact they have inequalities. We are much bigger on this. And if we can go on to the next slide, this is the direction of travel. Very grateful to some work by Professor Ying Jing. He did it for UK 2070, where he modeled the effect of different growth scenarios in this country. And on the higher growth scenario, what he found was that over 50% of the jobs would go to London and the wider southeast, which is less than a third of the population. And what that would do, and you might say, well, this is good news for London and the southeast. It's not, because you see escalating housing prices and longer travel times and major environmental issues as well. So on his modeling, even on a high growth scenario, we face significant challenges, and as Christine alluded to, missed opportunities in this country. So if we can then move on to the next slide, this is really saying, why have we got this problem? And here's the list of things that we picked out in our reports. First of all, we've been bedeviled by short-term policies that have then been undone. I've just listed a few acronyms here: urban development corporations, regional development agencies. They all have a half-life of about 3 or 4 years, maybe. And then somebody starts saying we need a new model. LEPS I could have added on the list, and so on. And that means we just do not have the consistent policy and delivery apparatus that you need to make a difference here. The second point is poorly funded. I'm sure somebody's going to say, oh, what about all the money that went into Europe? Well, from Europe, I should say. Well, again, I'm grateful to Ron for looking at the numbers. And what he finds is that in the period of discretionary spend, UK and Europe, the figure on average was 0.27% of the UK's GNI. It's minuscule. And the key point, the last point I make on this slide, it's been massively outweighed by where mainstream funding has gone. So we've had a regional policy in this country that it's just not moved in the direction that people think it does. And our underlying policies and housing Christine's talked about, and our approach to analysing projects have reinforced the sense of inequality. Add that up and you can see the sense of why we've not delivered. We move on to the next slide, if I can. This slide, if we can bring up the whole slide on this one. We've lost the picture on it, I think, if you can. That's it, great, thank you very much. I put this particular picture up from the Manchester Evening News, which was the front page of the Manchester Evening News when we produced our first report in May 2019. What was the point they were making here? The point they were making was around the comparisons with the UK and Germany, where Germany had made a serious effort to address the divisions in their country, not entirely succeeded, put serious money in seriously aligned policies, which had simply been absent in the UK. And as a result, the country had come from one country and become many, was the point we were making. In fact, some parts of the UK, some regions had lower GDP than East Germany prior to reunification. And that's why the Manchester Evening News said we need to tear down our own wall and start to move towards a single country. Move on to the next slide, if I can. This is a crucial point for me, really. We often hear conversations to say it's about connectivity, it's about skills, it's about housing, it's about the advanced economy, it's about the everyday economy. The truth is, it's not about any one of those. To deliver levelling up, you have to work on a whole range of areas. No one single thing will address the issue of levelling up. And our argument in the report was that whatever you do has to be comprehensive, large scale, and long term. Anything less than that is not going to deliver. We argued that the discretionary funds should be tripled from where they're going. So you should look to put in at least $1/3 of a trillion over the next 20 years. And that should be accompanied by an increase in infrastructure spend to 3% as opposed to the 1% now, and something like 4 billion going into tackling investing in universities and tackling the gap on centres of excellence. So I make this point because I really worry we're not going to learn the lessons of the past, and we're going to do incremental, fragmented projects. And truthfully, doing this comprehensive large-scale approach is the thing that government finds hardest to do. Let's be honest about it. So can I then move on to the next slide and say a few words about devolution here? I want to talk about the why and then the how, really. Why is devolution important? Well, let me just run through some of the key points. The first is the very kind of dispersed nature of our position in this country means that national policies don't work. Because we're an outlier, our very inequalities create a problem with national policies. Again, Christine talked about housing. You haven't got one housing market in the UK, you've got many. So single housing policies don't work. Single policies generally struggle. So devolution allows you to adapt what you do locally to local circumstances. Second point, we have an overloaded centre. I saw this when I was head of the civil service. The centre is way down with detail. I think it reached its peak for me when we had a conversation at full cabinet about starlings on a particular site and the inability to develop that site. This is the fallacy of power, that you can run everything from the centre. You can't, and what you have is an overloaded centre and disempowered places. Third point is, if you devolve, you get more equal growth, really. This is what the OECD has said. You don't necessarily get higher growth, you get more equal growth if you devolve. And I think finally, it allows the space for innovation, different models of delivery. And I'm involved in 3 or 4 different ones. Manchester Mayoral Development Corporation, Teesside, in Sheffield, they've developed a new model of physical regeneration. These things don't happen if you run them all from the centre. They couldn't happen if you run them all from the centre. The harder question here is not why, but how. We've been running a deal-based model, the box in the top left-hand picture on this slide. And that, I think, has reached the limits of what it can do. It did some useful things, but it's not enough. We need a more comprehensive approach. If we could click again, we'll see that. A comprehensive devolution model that has some sense of destination. And my personal view is that everywhere needs to move on. So even places that have significant devolution need to carry on the journey of devolution. There's no reason why places like Greater Manchester can't move closer, for example, to the devolved nations. So a stepping stones model is crucial. Mayors are right for some parts of the country, combined authorities, but not everywhere. And we're trying to fit one model again to every part of the country. And we mustn't confuse devolution with decentralisation. It's great that civil servants are moving out of Whitehall, but it's not the same as moving powers and funding out of Whitehall. You have to do the second if you really want to change the dial. And then finally, on my slides, I think, I talk here about the importance of devolution, but that alone won't be enough unless you have very clear national alignment on things like infrastructure, on the development of spatial plans for each of the nations. We have them in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We don't have one in the UK. And aligning the just transition to zero carbon in a way that is spatially just is crucial, in my view. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Just going to stop you, Bob. Thank you. That's we need you back running the civil service, I think. And I'm going to went into the last half an hour, and Professor Kate Pickett. If we can get our last 2 speakers to try to stick to my 9-10 minutes rule, we'll be fine. So, Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Will. Evening, everybody. When we start to use the language of levelling up, I think our minds turn quite naturally to images of level playing fields, you know, wanting to give everyone a fair chance, an equal opportunity to thrive and prosper. But of course, we all know that that is not how the world works for British children. not before COVID, and Bob just mentioned that old report on the experiences of the Northern child, and certainly not after. Now, there are two kinds of inequalities that are experienced by families, by children and young people in Britain today. The first is that they are all less likely to have good health and well-being, good levels of development and educational attainment compared to their peers who live in other more equal societies, including some that spend less on services than we do. But perhaps more relevant to today's discussion, within the UK, some children are much more likely than others to start their life's journey not on a level playing field, but burdened with risks and vulnerabilities, challenges and obstacles to overcome. It's as if they start out on life's journey already with weights and shackles. Now, the most recent data that we've got for life expectancy at birth before the pandemic reveal really shocking inequalities. There is a 20-year gap for girls growing up in areas with highest life expectancies in the south and the lowest life expectancies in the north. One region, Camden, had a life expectancy of 95.4 years for girls compared to somewhere in Leeds where it was 74.7. And for boys, that gap is even bigger, 27 years. Life expectancy in Kensington and Chelsea is 95.3 years compared to a shockingly low 68.3 years in Blackpool. And the places where children have got the lowest life expectancy are those urban areas in the major cities of the north: Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester, Liverpool, and Blackpool. And those huge inequalities in life expectancy, those were actually increasing before COVID, with life expectancy, in fact, going down, particularly for girls growing up in disadvantaged northern communities and in areas with pre-existing high levels of poverty. Now, if we've got more time together, don't worry, Will, I will finish on time. I could paint equally vivid pictures using shocking statistics to show you pre-pandemic inequalities for low birth weight, for premature deliveries, for infant mortality, for child mental health, parents' mental health, obesity, asthma, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. I could show you the same for low educational attainment, the risk of young people being not in employment, educational training, and for social mobility. And there is nothing natural about those inequalities. They're a consequence of poverty, of deprivation, and inequalities of wealth and income. They are unjust, but they are a result of how we organize society. They all got worse with a decade of austerity, but they are preventable, and we can do something to address them. So poverty is probably the biggest reason for the north-south divide in health and well-being and children's life chances. On average, levels of child poverty are higher in the north. There's a greater density of areas with very high levels of child poverty. And children growing up in poor families, they have more food insecurity, more housing insecurity, worse housing conditions, as we heard from Christine, fewer material resources of all kinds. But poverty and its direct material effects is just one side of the picture. Poverty also creates indirect effects on children's bodies and minds. It disrupts child brain development. It changes stress responses. It changes metabolic balance over the life course, including increasing the risk of many adult chronic diseases which burden our population health and our productivity. So if we want to level up the north-south productivity gap, first we have to level up the health gap, and the health gap starts in pregnancy and childhood. Now, COVID has of course made things worse. It's exposed and amplified health and social inequalities. And perhaps the most devastating long-term costs of the pandemic will be for today's children. COVID has changed their living conditions. It has hit their families' incomes and employment status. It's affected their education and their own access to health and social care services. Children in the north of England spent more time in lockdown, in more difficult circumstances, and this has affected their parents' mental well-being and their own mental health. The pandemic has really exacerbated the pre-existing problems for families in the north, increasing poverty, increasing family stress, and at the same time, it has removed from children protective environments such as good schools and access to supportive services. And if we don't act quickly and decisively for children and families, we won't be able to level up. In fact, we will risk leveling down in skills, increasing health inequalities, reducing social mobility, and decreasing societal productivity. But here are the hopeful things that come from focusing on families. First, you get a lot of bang for your buck. There's a massive body of evidence that shows what a great return we get from investing in early childhood. Spend £1 now and we would start realizing a return immediately, per child, per year. It's cost effective even during a budget crisis. Nobel Prize-winning economists know that one of the most effective strategies for economic growth is investing in the developmental growth of at-risk young children. There are cost savings through having to spend less on special education, less on remediation, less on healthcare and social services, less on criminal justice and more, and the accrual of benefits through increased self-sufficiency and productivity among families. You get to break long-standing intergenerational cycles of the perpetuation of poverty and inequality if you focus on children. And the second is this quick return. Yes, there are short-term costs. Some of the benefits will accrue over the lifetimes of the children we invest in, but there are immediate and short-term savings as well. And many of the levelling up priorities and projects that government are talking about will take a long time to produce benefits, but if you start investing in early childhood, we'll see dividends for society and for individual children's life chances from the start. The third is that we know what to do. We know that investment in early childhood education and care is really good. We know that apprenticeships are fabulous. We know that families need universal basic services, including digital connectivity and excellent public transport. And actually, we know how to bring communities together to create place-based solutions to local wealth creation and retention. We could use the Marmot indicators from Sir Michael's framework for reducing health inequalities. We could take UNICEF's approach to creating child-friendly cities. And why not a child-friendly country? We could use our amazing network of FE colleges to amplify skills and life chances of disadvantaged young people and smooth that post-16 transition. We could put youth workers in schools. We can work towards net zero exclusions from school. So when I was chairing the Greater Manchester Independent Inequalities Commission last winter and spring, I was constantly buoyed up by the creativity and innovation that communities themselves can bring to bear on problems, and how when you start involving families and young people in our decision making, we can grow place-based solutions to challenges. Two of the exciting ideas I heard about were the triple win possibilities of training young people for high-skilled work in the green economy. You get environmental, economic, health and social payoffs. Or supporting cooperative, mutual and social enterprise models for childcare. That creates high-quality jobs and high-quality care with local wealth retention. There's no shortage of community ideas and local investment that government could unlock through its priorities within levelling up. Now, if you've been paying attention to COP26 over the last week or so, you might have heard a lot of people discussing the benefits of regenerative economies. Investing in children and families creates a regenerative cycle of human and social capital. We won't level up without attention to families, children and young people. We'll just be stuck in that cycle of intergenerational poverty and inequality. But if we get it right, we won't just level up. We will thrive and flourish and prosper and grow. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Very interesting, your chairmanship of the Manchester initiative. I need to know more about that. Welcome, Neil. Nice to see you. We've just got one more speaker, and I think we should crack on to Jürgen, and then we'll come. There's a couple of questions. We'll come straight to you. But Jürgen, can we be tight, and then we'll hear what the minister has to say about our deliberations. Jürgen.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Will, and to the Academy for inviting me to speak at this. And my focus, and for those of you that know me, you won't be surprised. My focus is on innovation and creating very large-scaled innovation ecosystems that will help build the innovation powerhouses in levelling up regions. And of course, those are all there to support building the new fourth industrial revolution, the green industrial revolution, the low carbon industries of the future that have been mentioned quite a few times already. Kate, you just talked about them briefly in what you were saying. Now, these opportunities don't come around very often. The last time we had an opportunity to build a new industrial revolution was 40 plus years ago. And it was by design that we in the UK decided not to really massively take part in that third industrial revolution. So actually, I found it interesting listening to you, Adrian, at the beginning with all of your charts in terms of the disparities in the north and the south. And of course, it was quite predictable that that would happen, because if you deindustrialize mainly in your levelling up regions where those industries were creating the high productivity and the high wage jobs, and you replace them with lower paid service type jobs, which is exactly what we did. So the higher paid professional services jobs landed in London. More recently, we're pleased that some of them have landed in Leeds and Manchester and some of those cities, but predominantly we have low paid service jobs and call centers and these sorts of things. So really we missed out by design, and now we have an opportunity to take part by design. And what do we need to do in order to really take part in that fourth industrial revolution? Now, the good news is we do have a chance. You know, we spend a huge amount of money on research and development, 15 billion a year, and that's going to rise, we now know, to 20 billion. We were hoping it would be 22 a bit sooner, but it's going to be 20 billion. And that is good news. However, we also know that in terms of the combined R&D spend of industry, private sector and government, we lag a long way behind countries like South Korea, Japan, USA, China, Germany, France, etc. And that's mainly because we lack the private sector investment to match the government investment that is going in. And of course, part of that is that deindustrialization we saw. The huge local champions of ICI, of GEC, of Plessy, Ferranti, we all remember those names. Where are they now? Those were our R&D powerhouses, and countries that continued to play in the third industrial revolution retained more of those. In Germany, companies like Siemens that I used to run the operation for in the UK, but BASF and of course all of the major car manufacturers, etc. And we lost many of those. And actually in the UK, the only 2 R&D labs of major companies that are in the global top 100 that are in the UK are GSK and AstraZeneca, the only 2. And all of the others are somewhere else. So clearly, we need to find a way to create some more of those, and we need to encourage the inward investors, because actually most of our private sector R&D is driven by inward investing companies like the Siemenses, the Hitachis, the Teslas, the Amazons, the Googles, etc., etc. We need to encourage more of those to invest here in R&D. Now, the way to do this, I believe, is to create mega innovation ecosystems or clusters, which have real excellence, which have real power, and have real international reach, and therefore create industries that are highly innovative, highly productive, and can export. Now, to achieve that, there are 6 key criteria. And as a matter of fact, when I at Siemens was looking at where should I encourage Siemens to invest in the UK in R&D, it was these 6 criteria that we looked at. Now, luckily, I knew that quite a lot of these criteria would be covered by my previous speakers, so I'm only going to focus on 2. But I will just mention the other 4. One of them is all about market demand and market creation, which I'm not going to focus on today. Very interesting and very important, though. We did it particularly well for the offshore wind industry. We do it less well for some of our other industries. We're not yet doing it well enough for the new electric vehicle market, for example, not doing it well enough for the hydrogen economy, but we know how to do it because we did it for the offshore wind industry. The second is our sort of our taxation and our general business support environment, which the UK does, generally okay in. We need a bit more long-termism, a bit more stability, but we do okay. The third area is regulation. The fourth area is research and innovation excellence, in which the UK does particularly well, actually. And now I move on to the areas which need a lot more work. And the one that I'm particularly going to focus on is on scale, 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 and focus, focus, focus. And this is what we do particularly badly in the UK. We know that just scaling on research is not going to get us to the 2.4%. We have to scale the translational research, the innovation aspects. We need to create a mega Innovate UK. Now, it's pleasing that we're increasing the funding to Innovate UK from 740 million up to £1 billion now, as per the last CSR. But it's still not enough to get us to 2.4%, and especially not if we don't really focus that innovation and we scale it on the key areas that we're going to create that innovation excellence in. I mean, I'll start with a good example, which is announced today, which is, of course, the small modular reactors. I think this is a particularly good area, although it's quite niche. And I think it's good for the UK because the UK has the IP held largely by Rolls-Royce, but also by the broader nuclear industry. And I think this is a good space where investing around about, I'm just looking for my numbers, I think it's 190 million of government money can be well matched by the private sector to create a new industry of the future. But if you look at many of the other areas, green hydrogen, where so far the UK's 10-point plan has positioned 240 million. Germany's government spend for green hydrogen schemes is 7 billion euros. If you go to the telecom sector and 5G, the UK is currently investing about 230 million into that space. Germany, 7 billion. And if you look at catapults overall, which I'm particularly passionate about as the chair of one, we have a CEO of another one, spoke earlier today. Hi, Stuart. We need to massively scale those to support these ecosystems. And in the UK, they're currently funded with about 240 million per year, hopefully going to rise. But if you compare that to Germany's Fraunhofers, that are funded at 2.8 billion per annum, we're just talking of different levels of numbers. So scale and focus, fundamentally important. And then the final point I was going to mention is the one that's already been covered, but I will just emphasize, is the one of policy coordination. And all of that previous list I put around of creating market demand regulation, creating these new innovation megaclusters, all of that needs coordination and it needs some long-termism. And we do that extremely badly. And the way not to go forward with all of this increased spend is to fragment the money even more and turn it all into a huge bidding exercise of regions bidding for pots of money in a very decentralized and a very central controlled process, but it's to strategically decide in which regions we want what clusters to thrive and flourish, and then to allocate money and to allow for devolved regions to make the best decisions of how to then invest that money in the local ecosystems, both in terms of R&D, innovation, and of course, the skills system to support. And I think, Bob, you made that point extremely well. So in summary, where we lack and we need more focus is on scale and is on strategy and policy coordination. And I would also recommend that what we do is we do just have another look at where clusters and super clusters of innovation have really created prosperity, of where that's been successful. Bob, you mentioned the example of East Germany, and East Germany is definitely one of those examples, but there are other good ones that we can see as to how we can learn from those and how we can do more of those in our levelling up regions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, I'm going to go straight to Neil. Neil, you've heard a number, I mean, Jürgen's speaking passionately about the case for scale, focus, innovation. You've heard Kate kind of focusing on the kind of child issue, and across over the kind of last kind of 90 minutes, we focused on skills, we focused on finance, we focused on innovation, we focused on devolution, infrastructure. Some telling points have been made, but I think we really should throw the microphone to you with no more ado. Over to you.
Thank you, Will. And thank you for pulling together such a strong event with a fantastic set of panelists and a very distinguished cast of people attending as well. I'm sorry not to be able to make more of it. I had to go and take part in a debate, but I will make sure that we do try and capture, I know you're recording this, a whole bunch of the insights, because you do have fantastic lineup and fantastic discussion, clearly. So I hope that this will be the start of a conversation anyway, rather than the end of it. And my role in coming is really just to give a bit of an overview of both where we've got to in our thinking, and also some of the kind of outstanding questions that we are certainly grappling with at the moment, because no social sciences conference should end without more questions being generated. So we have a white paper out towards the end of this year on levelling up, but we've also just created the new department for levelling up housing and communities, and so that tells you something about the permanence of this effort, because we know that permanence is crucial to getting anywhere on this. And the white paper is an important milestone in that journey, but it's not the end of it. Let me start from the very top. Obviously, the debates about sort of economic imbalances in this country are not new. They've been going on for a century or more. How have things changed in the last couple of years? I suppose there is more of a sense now, I think more of a consensus that some of the gaps in economic performance around the UK, some of the gaps in opportunity are bigger in the UK than they are in some comparable countries. I suppose that would be a bit of a change. I think there's more of Phil McCann would be a sort of a person whose work I'd point to there as particularly highlighting that. There's more of an acknowledgement, I think, now about the limits of mobility alone as a solution. Clearly, it's an important part of what we need, and for a lot of people, mobility will be crucial to getting a better life. But particularly for lower qualified people, there are limits to that for a lot of people who can't move away from their family support network or from their community for various different reasons. I think there is a bit more clarity now about the risk that government can itself contribute to some of these problems. Ron Martin's work at the moment, looking at the relatively small scale of conscious levelling up or conscious regional policy over the years in the grand scheme of government spending, I think is good on this. And the danger is that you have a kind of a small regional policy over here, and yet you're making decisions in the mainstream of government spending, the bigger budgets, which completely outweigh that small regional spend, because they set up kind of Matthew effect type of things, that your transport spending or your housing and regeneration spending or your R&D spending follows existing strengths or follows existing patterns of congestion and existing high house prices. PM talked a bit about that, Matthew Effect, in his speech in the summer. That's drawing again on the work of people like Diane Coyle and Marianne Senzia. That's another change, I think, in the debate, and I think a bit more of just a sense that there is a missed opportunity here. That, you know, if you have an economy where parts of it are overheating, you can't get on the train, you can't afford a house, and yet there's parts of it where the physical capital is underused. If you have, you know, a lack of labour market matching, that, you know, there's an opportunity. If you could bring some of those opportunities a bit closer to people, not necessarily right to their doorstep, but a bit closer to people, then more people would be able to make the most of themselves and match their skills to trade up to higher levels of opportunity. So I think there have been some changes in the debate over the last couple of years. And in terms of how our levelling up agenda is responding to that, well, it's worth saying also what levelling up is not about as well as what it is. So it's not just about kind of north and south, which is a sort of characterization you get in the media. There's a recognition there, absolutely, that there are poor places within rich regions, and there are poor wards within rich local authorities even. But nonetheless, one can't get away also from a sense that there is a broad spatial pattern to the UK of very high levels and growth of incomes in and around London, and broadly the belt around it, the home counties, tailing away to lower levels of income down at the far end of the southwest in Wales, and particularly the kind of more urban areas of the North and Midlands, and obviously much lower living standards in places like Northern Ireland and some, though absolutely not all, some parts of Scotland around Glasgow. So there is a spatial story, but we are alive to the variations within that, not approaching it in a kind of crude way. There are 4 bits of levelling up, and each of them, you know, there are things that we are doing things on, but there are also some kind of outstanding questions, which I'd love the views of people taking part in this conference on. So there are 4 bits to it. There's, broadly speaking, the empowering kind of local leaders and local communities is the first bit. The second bit is about raising living standards and growing particularly the private sector, particularly where it's weak. The third bit is about spreading opportunity, improving public services, particularly where they're weaker, recognizing the connection between health problems and economic problems, between educational underachievement compared to people's potential and economic problems as well. And then fourth and finally, there is a certain the kind of je ne sais quoi factor, which is about kind of local pride, the sense of community, the physical environment. Is it a nice place? That kind of chunk of it. And things happening on all 4 of those. So in terms of local empowerment, obviously we now have city devolution deals, mayoral combined authorities covering 40% of England's population, 50% of England's GVA. We also have city and growth deals covering all of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and we can potentially deepen those devolution deals. There's lots of places that have ideas about how we might do that, and we've already discussed in this conference some of these issues. We can also, through those devolution deals and the expansion of them to widen out through the county deals process to more places, we can hopefully pick up this point about the fragmentation of funding pots, which Jürgen was just alluding to. If you're a local authority leader, there are something like 140 different funding streams that can potentially flow through your authority from the centre. Bob Kerslake, who's on the call, is a great expert on all of these things. But there is a challenge to defragment these things, to make them more flexible, to stop things coming in and out so quickly, so that places can pursue a genuine kind of long-term strategy with multi-year certainty. And things we've done recently, like the city region sustainable transport settlements, are a step in that direction towards a single pot for transport for those bigger cities. But of course, there's a last bit about local empowerment, which is not about kind of big local government stuff, but which is also about the kind of the lower level of civic society. You know, sort of parish councils are a sort of term of mirth in the UK, but for quite a lot of people, they are their kind of first experience of democracy, and they're kind of like the most direct experience of it, and their ability to get things done that they care about. There's a whole tier of kind of work that we're exploring about civic society and the kind of bridging and bonding capital and all the things that we can do to try and strengthen civic society to try and address some of these issues. In terms of raising living standards, there's lots of things we are doing in terms of tax measures, super deduction, free ports and so on. There's stuff about access to finance. We're expanding the work of the British Business Bank, trying to make sure we can get inward investment into every part of the UK through things like the new Global Britain Investment Fund. And I think there's big questions for all of us, including the people on this call, about how we reshape some of that, what I would call kind of growth enhancing spending, our R&D spending, our housing and regeneration money, transport spending. How do we change the way that we go about allocating that so that it drives levelling up? And how do we create more kind of defragmented budgets and more multi-year certainty? And then in the kind of the domain, the third thing I was talking about spreading opportunity. Obviously, we've been steadily building up what we're doing, trying to build a stronger technical system, bringing in the T levels with about a quarter more spending, a lot more time in the workplace, trying to get more people being able to retrain through the free level 3 offer, so you can go back and get A-level equivalents if you don't have them. The lifelong learning entitlement is to come, trying to get more high quality apprenticeships and so on. And I think one question that we're grappling with is about how you get more employer involvement in that and how we build on the successes of devolution so far. So I think some of the combined authorities, particularly West Midlands, have done really impressive things about reshaping those budgets through devolution. In schools, you know, we've had the structural reforms. We now have some good multi-academy trusts that are really managing to replicate success. But how do you get them to come out of the places like London, where they've got, you know, strong financial backing from both the funding formula and also external people, and get them growing in some of those places that need school improvement the most? And then in terms of health, you know, it's huge questions for us. You know, we have these big national programs, the 50,000 extra nurses, 40 new and refurbished hospitals and so on, and the announcements recently of the new community diagnostic hubs. How do we do more innovative stuff on prevention? How do we focus it in a way that it helps us to tackle some of those huge gaps in healthy life expectancy that we've been talking about in this conversation? And then last but not least, all these things about empowerment and lead on to a conversation about kind of regeneration. How do we build on the funding streams we've got for regeneration, brownfield and so on, High Streets Fund, the Towns Fund and so on? How do you build on those things and, as well as money, provide the powers that local authorities need to undertake really an epic challenge, which is, you know, every single town centre and city centre in the country is facing a complete transformation from the rise of online shopping because of the way we're all doing things differently now. How do they, you know, reshape those places so that they're places to live, to work and to enjoy yourself, as well as just places to shop? How do we build on some of the more locally led things that we've done in terms of crime and antisocial behaviour to give communities the tools they need to tackle those problems? So look, on all 4 of these different parts of the agenda, there are huge questions. And one of my goals in coming to this today was really to make contact with you and to say that I'm very easy to find online and my contact details are easy to get hold of. If people are doing interesting pieces of work on all these different things, I'd love to hear about them. We're extremely keen to build on your insights, recognizing, you know, the scale of the challenges on these things, you know, very long-lasting major problems, huge tectonic forces that have been acting against us, and also the you know, the lack of knowledge in a lot of these different fields about exactly what the right solution is. It's not just a political challenge, there's a genuine question about what is the right answer in some of them. So I'm very keen to engage with all the people who are involved in this event today. I'm really honoured to be asked to take part in it. I hope I've given you some sort of sense of the sorts of things that we're interested in. It's a big, quite expansive agenda. It's hugely important to the Prime Minister. So all of the people on this call who are doing work on it, you know, your work is hugely important to us. So I hope that we can build up a dialogue from this and go forward from the work you've been doing today to have an ongoing conversation, and so we can harvest the benefits of all the work that you're doing. So thank you very much for having me.
Neil, thank you so much. I didn't unmute myself quick enough. I mean, we've reached the end, really. Just going to take 2 or 3 more minutes to kind of just say, look, I mean, Academy of Social Sciences and social scientists, and actually the practitioners on this call, you know, really want to, you know, use the evidence and knowledge we have, you know, to strengthen your hand, to make it as coherent as it can be, and as comprehensive as it can be. There are a number of touch points, you've touched on them. So that's the first thing to say to you, that actually social scientists in the academy want to kind of, in a sense, connect you and be a connector. Second thing is that we do stand by time-limited, multidisciplinary kind of social science task forces, maybe not large in number, 6-8 people, but actually on issues that actually, are felt to be ones where, you need problems solved, and we stand ready to put those together and help you. You should know that in a day or two, next Thursday, we're publishing Place to Be, which is a report just showing how social scientists and universities have been engaging with the levelling up agenda around the country. But I think the big message that, I took lots of encouraging things from what you said. The need to get multi-year settlements, make it less make funding less fragmented and fundamental, I think. I think, the kinds of points that Jürgen were making about scale and focus, really important. Bob Kerslake was talking about how to make it's not one, but 10 things. There's the relationships between the social and the economics, forcibly made by Kate Pickett. Educate the need actually to get kind of local leadership, maybe involving LEPs and local authorities, more in actually making sure skills are kind of fit for purpose spatially and sectorally. But look, there's not enough time, we're overrunning. I just want to thank you enormously for giving up your time. I want to thank all the speakers for what has been a kind of really, very rich TEDx event, exceeded my expectations. Thank you for the presentations. Thank you for the time that you've committed. I hope that those of you who've been asking questions, a lot of your questions were answered, in fact, by the presenters and by the kind of discourse we've had. It is an ongoing conversation. We will be doing more. We will be in touch with you, Neil, and then equally be in touch with us. We are, I spoke to the department actually at lunchtime today, making this point, this self-same point with Stephen Aldridge. So, we're trying to connect social science up with this agenda. Look, I'd like to finish with on an upbeat note, but I think, I think and the upbeat note is this, I think, which is that whatever your kind of, whatever your kind of politics, there's more of a kind of the emergent consensus about the kinds of things that need to be done to deal with spatial inequality than I think any other area of policy, actually. And actually the need to mobilize, the need to find resource, the need to follow through. The need to build institutions that will survive. And I suppose my last message is, think institutions which will embody, what you want and what we need to endure. But thank you very much, everybody. I think I should stop now. It's we've overrun only a little bit. Thank you all the presenters for the time and effort you put in. It's an ongoing conversation. We intend to have it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.